2023, Saudi Arabia accepted yuan for oil sales to China, not dollars, yuan. For 50 years, every barrel of oil traded globally was priced in US dollars. It was the foundation that kept American interest rates low, that allowed the US government to borrow cheaply, that made the dollar the unquestioned center of global finance. And then, without fanfare, without headlines, that system began to crack. Most people think BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is a political threat, a conspiracy to overthrow American power. It's not. This is about structure, not politics, about economic imbalances built over decades through gold reserves, settlement systems, and energy trade corridors that most people have never heard of. This is the gold corridor, not a master plan, a mechanical response to dollar dominance and the liquidity asymmetries it creates. The shift is already affecting your mortgage interest rate, the price you pay for gas, how much your savings are worth, the stability you take for granted. And it's happening whether you notice it or not.
Welcome to Late Economics, where economics becomes clear through the ideas and moments that shaped our world. Subscribe for more. The standard narrative goes like this. BRICS nations are enemies of the United States. They're plotting to destroy the dollar, collapse Western economies, and install a new world order run from Beijing or Moscow. That narrative is wrong. This isn't ideological warfare. It's not about hatred of America or desire for global domination. It's a structural response to a system that gives one nation and one currency disproportionate control over global trade. Here's the reality. When the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, every nation needs dollars to function. Want to buy oil from Saudi Arabia? You need dollars. Import electronics from China? Dollars. Settle international debts? Dollars. This creates constant structural demand for US currency. That demand allows the United States to borrow money at exceptionally low interest rates because the entire world is constantly buying treasury bonds to park their dollars somewhere safe. It's an extraordinary privilege. The US can run massive deficits, print money during crises, and export inflation to the rest of the world because those extra dollars get absorbed globally rather than staying within the domestic economy. But that privilege comes with a cost for everyone else. When you're a commodity-producing nation, when you dig gold from the ground, pump oil from wells, grow food that feeds billions, you're forced to trade in a currency you don't control. A currency issued by a foreign government. A currency that can be printed, manipulated, or weaponized through sanctions whenever that foreign government decides it's necessary. BRICS nations aren't trying to overthrow anything. They're building alternatives, quietly, methodically, creating parallel systems so that if the dollar stumbles, or if access to dollar-based financial infrastructure gets cut off, they won't collapse with it. The gold corridor isn't an attack, it's insurance. And the fact that it's necessary tells you everything about the imbalances built into the current system. Li Wei sits at a desk in Shanghai. It's 2008. The global financial crisis is unfolding in real time. American banks are collapsing. Lehman Brothers has filed for bankruptcy. The Federal Reserve is printing money at unprecedented rates to stabilize the system. Li Wei is a central bank analyst. His job is to manage China's foreign reserves, over $2 trillion held primarily in US Treasury bonds. On paper, China is wealthy. In reality, Li Wei is looking at a spreadsheet that reveals an uncomfortable truth. China's wealth isn't wealth. It's a promise denominated in dollars,
issued by a country that just demonstrated it will do whatever it takes to save itself, even if that means devaluing the currency China holds. Li Wei doesn't panic. He's trained to think in decades, not days. But he writes a memo, a careful, precise memo, suggesting that China begin exploring alternatives. Not abandoning the dollar, that would be reckless, but diversifying, building parallel systems, reducing dependence. That memo, and thousands like it written across Moscow, New Delhi, Brasilia, and Johannesburg, became the foundation of what we now call the Gold Corridor. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was a realization. The world's commodity producers began asking a simple question. Why do we settle our trades in a currency we don't control, issued by a country that can print more of it whenever it needs to? And slowly, quietly, they began building an answer. Across the world, in Moscow, a similar conversation is happening. Dmitry manages Russia's central bank reserves. He remembers 1998, the ruble crisis, hyperinflation, lines outside banks where people waited to withdraw savings that evaporated faster than they could spend them. Russia has recovered since then, but the memory lingers. The sense that holding wealth in someone else's currency is fundamentally fragile. After 2008, Dmitry begins overseeing something new: gold purchases. Steady, quiet. Month after month, Russia converts dollars into metal. Not because they expect the dollar to collapse tomorrow, but because they've learned that paper promises can break. Gold doesn't. In New Delhi, similar decisions are being made. In Brasilia, in Johannesburg. Not coordinated, not centrally planned, but aligned by the same structural logic. If your wealth is stored in someone else's currency, you're at their mercy. And 2008 proved that mercy can run out fast. Li Wei doesn't know Dmitry. They've never met. They'll never collaborate. But they're both part of the same quiet global shift, a movement away from dependence and towards sovereignty. The Gold Corridor is being built not by politicians, but by analysts, by central bankers, by people who understand that economic systems, like all systems, eventually fail. And when they do, the nations that prepared survive. Picture a vault beneath the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It's 1971. The air is cold, sterile. The walls are lined with gold bars, thousands of them stacked neatly, each stamped with weight and purity markings. This gold doesn't all belong to the United States. Much of it belongs to other nations who, for decades, trusted that the dollar was as good as gold, because the US government promised it could be exchanged for the real thing. But that promise is about to break. President Nixon announces on a Sunday evening that the United States will no longer convert dollars into gold. The Bretton Woods system, the architecture that made the dollar the world's reserve currency, ends. Not with a war, not with a crisis, just a policy shift delivered calmly on television. In the vault, nothing moves. The gold stays. But upstairs, in offices and trading rooms and government ministries around the world, everything changes. The dollar is no longer backed by gold. It's backed by trust, by belief, by the assumption that the US economy is strong enough, stable enough, powerful enough to make its paper valuable. And for decades, that belief holds. Fast forward to 2008. You're in a different vault now. Moscow. The air is just as cold, but the gold is newer. Freshly minted bars stamped with Russian hallmarks, stacked in rows that stretch into the dim fluorescent light. Russia has been buying gold, not for speculation, for sovereignty. The 1998 ruble crisis taught Russia what it feels like to be at the mercy of a currency you can't control. The sanctions that followed taught them that access to dollars can be revoked at any moment for political reasons. This gold isn't just a reserve, it's independence in physical form. And Russia isn't alone. China is buying, India is buying, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Poland. Central banks across the world are quietly converting dollars into metal. The vaults are filling again. But this time, the gold isn't backing a currency. It's backing an idea that maybe the world doesn't need to run on dollars forever. In Shanghai, a new kind of infrastructure is being built. Not vaults, but systems. The Shanghai Gold Exchange launches in 2016, allowing gold to be traded and settled in yuan instead of dollars. At first, it's symbolic. Most global traders still prefer dollar-denominated exchanges in London and New York. The liquidity is better, the infrastructure is proven. But China doesn't need it to dominate immediately. They just need it to exist, to function, to prove that alternatives are possible. Chinese banks begin encouraging domestic firms to use the Shanghai Exchange, then Russian companies, then Middle Eastern exporters, then African mining operations. The pitch is simple. Why convert your currency into dollars, pay transaction fees, and expose yourself to US sanctions risk when you can settle directly in yuan or physical gold? It's not a revolution, it's a trickle. But trickles, over time, carve canyons. By 2020, a meaningful portion of China's gold trading happens outside the dollar system. The infrastructure is operational. The legal frameworks are in place. The custodial services are proven. It's no longer theoretical, it's functional. The petrodollar system was born in the 1970s through agreements between the United States and Saudi Arabia. In exchange for military protection and political support, Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exclusively in dollars. Other OPEC nations followed. This wasn't just convenient, it was structural. Any country wanting to buy energy had to acquire dollars first. It locked the world into a cycle. Earn dollars through exports, use those dollars to buy oil, hold extra dollars as reserves in case you need more oil later. Because oil powers everything: factories, shipping, transportation, agriculture. The petrodollar effectively made the US dollar the operating system of the global economy. But in 2023, that system fractures. Saudi Arabia begins accepting yuan for oil sales to China. Russia, cut off from dollar-based payment systems due to sanctions, starts invoicing energy exports in rubles and yuan. India, buying discounted Russian oil, settles payments in rupees. Each transaction is small, but together they represent a crack in a system that seemed unbreakable. The petrodollar isn't dead, but it's no longer exclusive, and that changes everything. Your mortgage interest rate. Your mortgage, your car loan, your credit card. The interest rate you pay is shaped by a global system most people never think about: the structural demand for US dollars. When the dollar is the world's reserve currency, every nation needs to hold dollars to trade. That constant demand allows the United States to borrow money through treasury bonds at extremely low interest rates. The world is always buying those bonds, parking their dollars somewhere safe. That cheap borrowing trickles down. It keeps US interest rates lower than they would be otherwise. Your mortgage, your car payment, your credit card rate, they're all slightly cheaper because of this global system built 70 years ago. But what happens if that demand weakens? If nations start settling trade in yuan, rubles, or rupees? If they stop buying as many treasury bonds? Interest rates rise, not because of anything you did, not because the economy suddenly worsened, but because the structural advantage the US has enjoyed for decades is eroding. You won't see it framed as BRICS causes mortgage rates to climb. It'll be technical. Federal Reserve struggles to attract foreign buyers. Treasury yields spike amid shifting global demand. But the result is the same. Your monthly payment goes up. And the reason traces back to decisions made in Shanghai, Moscow, and New Delhi about how to settle oil trades and where to store reserves.
The price of oil. Oil has been priced in dollars for 50 years. This system, the petrodollar, was born through agreements between the US and Saudi Arabia. In exchange for military protection, Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exclusively in dollars. Other OPEC nations followed. This locked the world into a cycle. Any country wanting to buy energy had to acquire dollars first. It made the dollar essential, not just for trade with America, but for trade with everyone. And because oil powers everything, the petrodollar made the US dollar the currency of the global economy. But that's changing. In 2023, Saudi Arabia began accepting yuan for oil sales to China. Russia, sanctioned out of dollar-based payment systems, started invoicing energy exports in rubles and yuan. India, buying discounted Russian oil, settled payments in rupees. Each transaction is small, but together they crack the foundation of a system that seemed permanent. Here's where it affects you. When oil is priced in dollars, the US can print more currency during a crisis without immediately seeing inflation spike in energy costs. Why? Because global oil demand absorbs those extra dollars. The system recycles them. But if oil starts trading in multiple currencies, that absorption weakens. More dollars stay inside the US economy. More dollars chasing the same goods means inflation. You see it at the gas pump first, then at the grocery store because food production depends on fuel. Then in shipping costs, which get passed to everything you buy online. It's not sudden, it's a slow, grinding shift, and most people will never connect it to the fact that Saudi Arabia started accepting yuan.
Your savings account. You've been responsible. You've saved money. Maybe $10,000, $50,000 or more. You're not rich, but you've built a cushion. Now imagine this. Every year, that money loses value. Not because you spent it, not because the bank failed, but because inflation quietly erodes its purchasing power. This is normal, you think. Inflation is just part of life. But here's what most people don't realize. The rate of inflation you experience is directly connected to how much demand there is for the dollar. When the world uses dollars for trade, there's constant demand for US currency. That demand acts like a sponge, soaking up excess dollars the Federal Reserve prints. It keeps inflation lower than it would be otherwise. But if BRICS nations start using their own currencies for trade, if they build systems to settle transactions in yuan, rubles, or gold, that sponge shrinks. Fewer nations need to hold dollars. Fewer nations buy treasury bonds. And the dollars that used to circulate globally start piling up inside the United States. More dollars in the domestic economy, same amount of goods. Prices rise. Your $50,000 in savings doesn't change in number, but what it can buy does. In 5 years, maybe it buys what $40,000 used to. In 10 years, $30,000. You didn't make a bad investment. You didn't gamble poorly. You simply held a currency that the world slowly stopped needing as much. And the shift happened so gradually that by the time you noticed, it was already too late to adjust. Imports and the cost of everything. Walk into any store. Most of what you see, clothes, electronics, furniture, kitchenware, was made somewhere else. Manufactured in China, assembled in Vietnam, shipped across oceans. This global supply chain runs on dollars. The factory in Shenzhen prices goods in yuan, but when it exports to the US, the transaction settles in dollars. The shipping company invoices in dollars. The importer pays in dollars. And because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, it's historically been strong. A strong dollar means you can buy more foreign goods for less money. That $50 shirt made in Bangladesh is $50 instead of $75 because of exchange rates. But if BRICS nations start trading among themselves in local currencies, they reduce their need for dollars. Less demand for dollars means the currency weakens relative to others. A weaker dollar makes everything you import more expensive. That $50 shirt becomes $60, then $70. The smartphone you were planning to buy goes from $800 to $950. Add 20% to everything. It's not that the products changed, it's that the currency you're using to buy them is worth less on the global stage. And because so much of what Americans consume is imported, this hits everywhere. Food, medicine, electronics, gasoline, all of it gets more expensive, not because of corporate greed or supply chain disruptions, but because the structural advantage the dollar enjoyed for decades is quietly fading. Politicians will blame other things: inflation, price gouging, geopolitical instability. Those factors exist, but underneath is something simpler. The world is building systems that don't need the dollar as much, and that changes the math on everything you buy. Manufacturing and jobs. There's a factory in Ohio. It closed in 2015. The machinery was sold off, the building sits empty, and the workers who once earned middle-class wages now piece together gig jobs and part-time shifts. You might think this is just about outsourcing, about companies chasing cheap labor overseas. That's part of it. But there's another force. The dollar's dominance made American manufacturing uncompetitive. Because the dollar is the global reserve currency, it's always in high demand. That demand keeps the dollar strong. A strong dollar is great if you're buying imports. But if you're trying to export goods, if you're an American factory trying to sell products to the world, a strong dollar makes your goods expensive. A German car manufacturer can sell to China more easily than an American one, not because the German car is better, but because the euro isn't carrying the same reserve burden. The exchange rate works in Germany's favor. For decades, this dynamic hollowed out American manufacturing, not through bad management or laziness, but through structural economics. The very thing that made the dollar powerful made American factories less competitive. Now, imagine BRICS nations shift away from the dollar. The structural demand weakens. The currency softens. On paper, this might seem good for American manufacturing. A weaker dollar makes exports cheaper. But the industrial base is already gone. The factories are closed. The supply chains are dismantled. The workers have moved on. You can't just flip a switch and bring it back. Rebuilding takes decades, billions of dollars, and political will that's hard to sustain. So you're left with the worst of both worlds. A weaker dollar that makes imports more expensive, but no domestic production to replace them. Prices rise, wages stagnate, and the middle class continues to erode. The factory in Ohio isn't coming back, and the system that killed it is now changing in ways that won't save it. The stability you take for granted. Most people never think about stability. The fact that you can wake up, go to work, buy groceries, pay rent, and assume the system will keep functioning. That prices won't double overnight, that your bank account will still have money in it, that the currency you earn today will be worth something tomorrow. This stability isn't natural, it's constructed. And for 50 years, it's been built on the foundation of dollar dominance. Because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, the US has been able to run enormous deficits without immediate consequences. It can borrow cheaply, spend lavishly, and print money during crises without triggering the inflation that devastates other nations. Why? Because those extra dollars don't just stay in the US economy. They flow outward into global trade, into foreign reserves, into the financial systems of other countries. The world absorbs the excess. But if that changes, if BRICS nations build alternative systems and reduce their dollar reliance, that absorption weakens. The excess dollars stay home, and the stability you've taken for granted starts to crack. It won't happen overnight. There won't be a single moment when everything collapses. But slowly, steadily, you'll notice things shifting. Prices less predictable, interest rates more volatile. The sense that the system, which once felt solid, now feels fragile. This isn't about BRICS destroying the dollar. It's about BRICS reducing their dependence on it. And that reduction, gradual as it is, removes one of the shock absorbers that's kept the US economy stable for decades. You won't see it framed that way in the news. You'll see inflation reports, Federal Reserve announcements, debates about fiscal policy. But underneath all of it is a structural shift. The world is building systems that work without the dollar. And the stability you've always assumed was permanent was only ever as strong as the system holding it up. To be inserted into existing Part 1 content. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Samarkand, 2022. The session halls are modern, climate-controlled, outfitted with simultaneous translation booths and digital displays showing real-time economic data. But outside, through the tall windows, you can see the old city, Registan Square, Tilia Kori Madrasa with its turquoise domes, walls that were already ancient when Genghis Khan's armies swept through Central Asia. There's a symbolic weight to the location. This city was once the heart of the Silk Road, the trading network that connected East and West long before European colonial powers drew their maps. And now, representatives from nations representing half the world's population are meeting here to discuss a new kind of trade route. Not silk and spices, gold and sovereignty. The informal side meetings happen during coffee breaks, in hallways, in small conference rooms away from the main sessions. This is where the real work happens, where central bank officials compare notes, where trade ministers discuss settlement infrastructure, where finance deputies ask careful questions about custody protocols and purity verification. One conversation in particular matters. A Chinese official, mid-50s, grey suit, speaks fluent Russian and passable Arabic, is talking quietly with a Russian counterpart. They're discussing something that won't appear in any official communique. The Americans believe this is about challenging their power, the Chinese official says. Isn't it? The Russian replies. A pause. It's about having options, the Chinese official says carefully. When you have only one route for something essential, food, water, money, you're not free. You're dependent, and dependence becomes leverage. The Russian nods slowly. But creating options requires infrastructure, and infrastructure requires years to build, which means we have to start now, even if we're not sure we'll need it urgently in 5 years. Correct, the Chinese official says. Insurance before the fire, not after. They're interrupted by an announcement. The next session is beginning, but as they walk back toward the main hall, the Russian official adds one more thought. The West built the current system when they had overwhelming economic power. Now that power is diffusing. The system will adapt. The only question is whether it adapts peacefully through gradual infrastructure development or chaotically through crisis-driven fragmentation. The Chinese official doesn't respond immediately. Then, quietly, "We prefer gradual." Let's talk about what it takes to move 400 kilograms of gold across borders. Physical gold is not digital. You can't wire it, can't email it, can't settle it with a keystroke. It exists as metal. Bars weighing 12.5 kilograms each, stamped with serial numbers, purity certifications, refinery marks.
To move it legally between nations requires, first, authentication. An assayer, someone certified to verify gold purity, must test the bars. This involves visual inspection for proper stamping, weight verification to 6 decimal places, X-ray fluorescence scanning to confirm purity, sometimes destructive testing, drilling small samples for chemical analysis. This process takes hours. For a large shipment, days. Second, custody documentation. Legal title to gold must be established clearly. This requires original purchase documentation, chain of custody records showing every transfer since the gold left the refinery, tax compliance certificates proving export duties were paid, insurance documentation covering theft, damage, or loss during transit. Third, physical security. Moving 400 kilograms of gold, worth roughly $25 million at current prices, requires armored transport, armed security, and specialized logistics. The vehicle must be GPS tracked. Routes must be planned to avoid high-risk areas. Personnel must be background checked and bonded. Fourth, customs clearance. Both the exporting and importing nations must approve the shipment. This involves export licenses, import permits, sanctions compliance verification, anti-money laundering checks. Each step introduces delay. Each step introduces cost. Each step creates points where the transaction could be blocked. And this is under normal circumstances. Now add geopolitical tension. Imagine Russia trying to ship gold to China during a period of heightened Western sanctions. The gold itself isn't sanctioned. Gold is fungible, internationally recognized, exempt from most financial restrictions. But the logistics become complicated. Which airspace can the cargo plane fly through? Which ports will allow the vessel to dock? Which insurance companies will underwrite the shipment? Which security firms will provide personnel without violating sanctions on service provision? Suddenly, a transaction that should take 3 days takes 3 weeks, or doesn't happen at all. This is why the BRICS Gold Corridor isn't just about payments. It's about logistics infrastructure. The proposal includes designated custody facilities in neutral jurisdictions, Switzerland, Singapore, UAE. Pre-certified assayers whose verifications are mutually recognized by all member nations. Standardized documentation protocols that eliminate redundant paperwork. Shared insurance pools to reduce costs. Diplomatic agreements ensuring gold shipments receive preferential customs treatment. All of this takes years to build, but once built, it transforms gold from a static reserve asset into a dynamic settlement tool. Not replacing dollars, complementing them, providing an alternative when dollar systems become unavailable, unreliable, or unacceptably expensive. Let's talk about how central banks think about gold. In a conference room at the South African Reserve Bank in Pretoria, a debate is happening. The topic?
Should South Africa increase its gold reserves in preparation for potential participation in BRICS settlement infrastructure? South Africa currently holds about 125 metric tons of gold. Modest compared to the United States, 8,133 tons, or Germany, 3,355 tons. But substantial compared to many emerging economies. The question on the table: should they acquire another 100 to 200 tons? The arguments in favor: gold is the only truly neutral reserve asset, one deputy governor argues. Dollars can be frozen, euros can be sanctioned, even yuan holdings create political dependencies. But gold held in your own vaults, under your own jurisdiction, can't be weaponized against you. If we're serious about participating in gold-backed settlement, another official adds, we need adequate reserves. 125 tons isn't enough to handle significant trade volumes. If we're settling even 10% of our China trade through gold, we'd need 300 to 400 tons minimum. And buying gold now, before other central banks increase their purchases, means we acquire it at current prices. If everyone tries to accumulate simultaneously, prices rise. We'd be buying at a premium. The arguments against: we don't know if this settlement system will actually materialize, a skeptical economist counters. We could spend billions acquiring gold for infrastructure that never gets built. That capital could be deployed elsewhere: debt reduction, infrastructure investment, social spending. Gold pays no interest, the chief financial officer notes. Every dollar we hold in gold is a dollar not earning returns in treasuries or other interest-bearing assets. On 100 tons of gold, roughly $6 billion, we'd be foregoing maybe $180 million annually in potential interest income. And there's reputational risk, a third official adds. If we announce major gold acquisitions, markets interpret that as lack of confidence in fiat currencies. Our own currency could weaken. Foreign investors might reduce holdings of South African bonds. The debate continues for hours. Eventually, they reach a compromise. South Africa will acquire 50 additional tons over the next 18 months. Slowly, quietly, through regular market purchases that don't signal panic or dramatic policy shifts. This gives them optionality, enough gold to participate meaningfully if the settlement system materializes, without committing so much capital that they can't reverse course if the initiative fails. It's cautious, it's pragmatic, and it's being replicated in central banks across the BRICS nations and beyond. Not dramatic accumulation, steady incremental increases in gold reserves, flying under the radar of financial media, but collectively representing a significant shift in how emerging economies think about monetary sovereignty. Let's talk about the mathematics of settlement timing. Traditional international trade settlement through dollar-based correspondent banking. Day 0, exporter ships goods. Day 3 to 5, importer's bank initiates payment. Day 5 to 7, correspondent bank verifies and routes payment through SWIFT. Day 7 to 9, intermediary banks process and take their fees. Day 9 to 12, payment arrives in exporter's account. Total, 9 to 12 business days on average. During those 9 to 12 days, exporter has delivered goods but hasn't received payment, cash flow strain. Importer has committed funds, but goods might still be in transit, risk exposure. Currency exchange rates might fluctuate, potentially eroding transaction value. Banks collect fees at multiple stages, reducing net payment. Now consider gold-backed bilateral settlement. Day 0. Exporter ships goods. Day 1. Goods clear customs, verified electronically. Day 1-2. Importing nation's central bank initiates gold transfer authorization. Day 2. Shared custody vault confirms gold weight and purity. Day 2. Legal ownership transfers from importer's account to exporter's account. Day 2. Exporter's central bank credits domestic currency to exporter's account. Total, 2 to 3 business days. The difference, 6 to 9 days of eliminated settlement time, matters enormously to businesses operating on thin margins. A Chinese manufacturer importing Brazilian iron ore doesn't care about geopolitical theory. They care that gold settlement means their capital isn't locked in transit for an extra week. A Russian energy company exporting to India doesn't care about dollar hegemony. They care that gold settlement eliminates 3 layers of correspondent banking fees. This is how infrastructure wins adoption, not through ideology, through superior performance on metrics businesses actually care about: cost, speed, reliability. And once businesses discover that gold settlement offers measurable advantages, they start preferring it. Not exclusively, but increasingly, for the transactions where it makes financial sense, which, as the infrastructure matures, becomes more and more transactions. Let's talk about what happens when a junior analyst at a mid-sized trade finance bank in Mumbai starts noticing something odd. She's reviewing settlement patterns for commodity imports, specifically crude oil from Russia and coal from Indonesia. Historically, these settlements showed predictable patterns: large dollar transfers, routed through correspondent banks in New York or London. Fees around 0.3 to 0.4% of transaction value. But over the past 6 months, she's noticed anomalies. Some transactions are settling faster than they should. Some are showing lower fee structures. Some aren't appearing in Swift message traffic at all. She flags it to her supervisor. "I think some of our clients are using alternative settlement systems," she says. The supervisor, 20 years in trade finance, looks at the data. "Gold," he says after a moment. "How do you know?" "Because these patterns match what we'd expect if payments were being routed through bilateral central bank arrangements instead of commercial correspondent banking. Faster settlement, lower fees, no Swift messaging." The analyst pulls up more data. Is this legal? Completely. There's no requirement that international trades settle in dollars. It's just been the default because the infrastructure was built around dollar clearing. But if alternative infrastructure exists, businesses will use it if it's cheaper and faster. Should we offer this to our other clients? The supervisor pauses. That's a policy question. We'd need approval from senior management, and we'd need to understand the implications: regulatory, reputational, strategic. But technically, we could? Technically, yes. We'd need to establish relationships with the central banks involved, get access to the custody systems, train our staff on the protocols. But yes, technically we could offer gold-backed settlement as an option. The analyst makes a note. This conversation is happening in hundreds of banks across Asia, Africa, and South America. Not all at once, but gradually. As junior analysts notice patterns, as supervisors recognize opportunities, as senior management weighs strategic implications, and each time a bank decides to offer gold settlement as an option, the infrastructure gets a little stronger. The network effects get a little more powerful. The alternative becomes a little more normal. Loop 1. The first gold purchase. The financial crisis is still smoldering. Banks are stabilized, but trust is shattered. In Beijing, a decision is made. China will begin buying gold, Not a little, a lot. The purchases are discreet. No announcements, no press releases. Chinese state banks quietly enter global markets, acquiring bullion through intermediaries, storing it in vaults that don't appear on public ledgers. Why? Because China learned a lesson. Paper assets, stocks, bonds, dollars can evaporate. Lehman Brothers proved it. AIG proved it. The entire Western financial system came within hours of total collapse. Gold doesn't collapse. It sits. It waits. It holds value across centuries, empires, currencies. Other nations watch. Russia sees what China is doing and follows. Then Kazakhstan, Turkey, India. Central banks worldwide begin accumulating gold, shifting reserves away from dollars and into metal. The price of gold rises, not from industrial demand, from fear. Fear that the next crisis won't be solved by printing more money. Fear that the currency everyone depends on might not be dependable forever. In those rising gold prices, a signal is sent. The world is hedging. Loop 2. The yuan goes international. China launches the Shanghai Gold Exchange, where gold can be traded and settled in yuan, not dollars. For the first time, there's a major commodity market that doesn't require US currency. At first, it's curiosity. Most global traders prefer dollar-denominated exchanges in London and New York. Better liquidity, proven infrastructure. But slowly, Chinese banks encourage domestic firms to use Shanghai. Then Russian companies, Middle Eastern exporters, African mining operations. The pitch: why convert to dollars, pay transaction fees, and expose yourself to US sanctions risk when you can settle directly in yuan or physical gold? It's not revolution, it's a trickle. But trickles carve canyons. By 2020, meaningful portions of China's gold trading happen outside the dollar system. Infrastructure operational, legal frameworks in place, custodial services proven, no longer theoretical, functional. Loop 3. Russia gets cut off. Russia invades Ukraine. The West responds with financial isolation. Russian banks removed from SWIFT, the messaging system that facilitates international payments. Overnight, Russia's ability to settle trade in dollars and euros is severed. Analysts predict economic collapse. How can Russia function without access to the global financial system? Russia doesn't collapse, it pivots. Oil and gas exports continue flowing to Europe, but now they're invoiced in rubles, or yuan, or settled through barter. Russian energy for Chinese electronics, Russian wheat for Indian machinery. Gold becomes a settlement tool. Russian exporters accept yuan, convert it to gold on Shanghai's exchange, then sell for rubles or hold as reserves. Clunky, inefficient compared to dollar systems, but it works. And more importantly, it proves something. International trade can function without dollars if you're willing to build alternative infrastructure. Other nations take note. If Russia can survive outside the dollar system, maybe we can too. Not because we want to, because we might need to. Loop 4. Saudi Arabia's quiet shift. For 50 years, Saudi Arabia anchored the petrodollar system. Every barrel of oil it exported was priced in dollars. Non-negotiable. The deal that underpins global energy markets. Then, quietly, Saudi Arabia accepts yuan for oil sales to China. The announcement is buried. No grand press conference. Just a technical adjustment in payment terms. But the implications are enormous. If Saudi Arabia, the most important oil exporter in the world, accepts currencies other than dollars, The petrodollar system is no longer absolute. It's optional. Other producers watch. UAE discusses yuan settlements. Russia has already moved. Iran, locked out of dollar markets by sanctions, has used alternative currencies for years. Slowly, barrel by barrel, the exclusive link between oil and dollars frays. Every time a nation buys oil in yuan instead of dollars, that's one fewer reason to hold massive dollar reserves, one fewer treasury bond purchase, one fewer vote of confidence in the system that held the global economy together since 1971. Loop 5. India plays both sides. India occupies unique territory, aligned with the West through democratic values and strategic partnerships, but also a BRICS member that needs cheap energy. When Russia offers discounted oil Europe won't buy due to sanctions, India doesn't hesitate. Millions of barrels, settled in rupees and rubles, not dollars. This isn't ideological, it's pragmatic. India's economy runs on energy. Russian oil is cheaper, and settling in local currency avoids sanctions risk and transaction fees. But the effect is the same. Every rupee-ruble oil transaction bypasses the Western financial system entirely. India also accumulates gold aggressively, building reserves that provide flexibility. If the dollar weakens, India has a hedge. If the yuan rises, India has options. India isn't trying to destroy the dollar. It's trying to survive in a world where the dollar might not always be reliable. And in doing so, it contributes to the erosion it's hedging against. Loop 6. The BRICS payment system. BRICS nations announce an alternative payment system, not to replace SWIFT, but to create parallel infrastructure that doesn't depend on Western approval. The system allows member nations to settle trade in their own currencies. A Brazilian company buying Indian textiles pays in reals, automatically converted to rupees without touching dollars. Not seamless yet. Technical glitches, liquidity issues, trust problems, but functional and growing. More nations express interest: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Argentina, Indonesia, not because they hate the dollar, but because they've seen sanctions wielded as weapons. If you might someday find yourself on the wrong side of US foreign policy, having a backup system isn't paranoia, it's prudence. The BRICS payment system isn't a threat today, but it's infrastructure, and infrastructure once built gets used, especially when it's more convenient, cheaper, or less politically risky. Loop 7. Gold as the neutral reserve. Central banks are reaching a quiet realization. Holding dollars exposes you to US monetary policy. Holding euros exposes you to the European Central Bank. Holding yuan exposes you to Beijing. But gold? Gold has no central bank, no government can print more, no policy committee can devalue it overnight. Gold is neutral. And in a world where currency wars are increasingly possible, neutrality is valuable. Nations buy gold, not to return to a gold standard, nobody suggests that, but to diversify away from any single currency, to build reserves that can't be frozen, sanctioned, or devalued by political decisions in Washington, Brussels, or Beijing. By 2024, central banks are buying gold at rates not seen since the 1960s. Most buying comes from BRICS nations and their allies. The gold isn't backing a new currency, it's backing sovereignty, the ability to trade, settle debts, and maintain economic independence, regardless of what happens to the dollar. Loop 8. Commodity pricing shifts. For decades, global commodities, oil, natural gas, wheat, copper, lithium, were priced in dollars. If you wanted Brazilian soybeans or Chilean copper, you paid in dollars. This created structural demand. Every nation needed dollars not just for US trade, but for trade with each other. Now that's changing. China, the world's largest commodity importer, negotiates contracts in yuan. Russian exporters accept rubles.
Brazilian soy traders price in reals for South American sales. Each shift is small. Together, they represent fundamental change in how global commodity markets operate. Commodities are the foundation of everything. Energy powers factories, metals build infrastructure, food sustains populations. If trade in these essentials no longer requires dollars, structural demand for the currency weakens, not sudden collapse, a slow leak. But slow leaks, left unattended, eventually drain the tank.
Loop 9. The Middle East watches. The Middle East has been the petrodollar system's cornerstone. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait. These nations recycled oil revenues into US Treasury bonds for decades, providing cheap financing for American deficits. But the relationship is fraying. US energy independence, driven by shale oil, reduced America's dependence on Middle Eastern oil. Political priorities shifted. Gulf states no longer feel they can rely on unconditional US support. So they diversify, explore trade agreements with China, their largest customer, discuss joining BRICS, begin accepting yuan for oil. This isn't betrayal, it's adaptation. The world is changing, and the Middle East is adjusting to remain relevant. But for the dollar, it's a problem. If the nations that anchored the petrodollar system start trading in multiple currencies, the entire architecture that made the dollar indispensable begins to crumble. And once that architecture is gone, it's nearly impossible to rebuild. Loop 10. The African shift. Africa has been trapped in dollar dependency for decades. Most African nations earn foreign currency through commodity exports, oil, minerals, agricultural products. But those exports are priced in dollars. The problem, acquiring dollars often means borrowing them. From the IMF, from Western banks, on terms including austerity measures, privatization requirements, and political conditions. China offers an alternative. Infrastructure loans denominated in yuan, trade agreements settled in local currencies, investment partnerships without Western-style governance demands. It's not altruism. China needs African resources, cobalt for batteries, rare earth metals for electronics, agricultural land for food security. But the terms are different. Less paternalistic, more transactional. African nations start shifting. Not completely, not overnight, but trade with China grows. Yuan reserves increase. Structural need to hold dollars weakens. For Africa, this is about options. For the dollar, it's another region slowly decoupling. Loop 11. The digital yuan. China launches the digital yuan, a central bank digital currency allowing instant, low-cost settlement of international transactions. No correspondent banks, no SWIFT, no dollars. Adoption starts slow. Most businesses prefer established systems, but China incentivizes usage. Lower transaction fees for digital yuan payments. Preferential trade terms for companies that adopt it. Gradual integration into Belt and Road Initiative projects. Within years, significant portions of China's international trade settle digitally, in yuan, outside traditional banking systems. And because infrastructure is built, other nations plug in. Russia integrates digital yuan into payment systems. Iran uses it to bypass sanctions. Smaller Asian and African nations adopt it because it's cheaper and faster. The dollar isn't replaced, but it's increasingly bypassed. Trade happens in parallel systems that don't need American approval or American currency. Loop 12. Europe hesitates. Europe watches with growing unease. The EU has its own currency and ambitions to challenge dollar dominance. But Europe is caught between competing pressures. Politically aligned with the United States, NATO ties, shared democratic values, security dependencies, economically dependent on BRICS nations, Russian energy, Chinese manufacturing, Middle Eastern oil. Europe tries playing both sides, maintains dollar-based trade with the US, while quietly exploring alternative payment systems with China and Russia. Doesn't join BRICS, but doesn't fully oppose them. This hedging accelerates the shift. If even US allies are building backup systems, the signal is clear. Nobody believes dollar dominance is permanent anymore. Loop 13. Inflation starts to bite. By 2025, US inflation is no longer just policy debate, it's lived reality. Grocery prices climb 40% in 5 years. Gas prices swing wildly. Housing costs detach completely from wage growth. The Federal Reserve blames supply chain disruptions, fiscal spending, corporate greed. Those factors exist, but underneath is something structural. The world isn't absorbing as many dollars. BRICS nations trade among themselves in local currencies. Global reserves shift toward gold and yuan. Treasury bond auctions attract fewer foreign buyers. More dollars stay inside the US economy. More dollars chasing the same goods means rising prices. The average American doesn't connect grocery bills to decisions in Beijing or Moscow. They blame politicians, corporations, bad luck. But the connection exists. The slow erosion of dollar dominance shows up in everyday prices, and it's only beginning. Loop 14. Trust becomes the currency. Reserve currencies aren't just economics, they're trust. The dollar became the world's reserve currency because, after World War II, the United States was the most stable, powerful, trusted nation on Earth. Holding dollars meant safety. But trust erodes. Every financial crisis chips away. Every sanction weaponizes it. Every time the US uses its financial system as a geopolitical tool, other nations think, could that happen to us? BRICS nations aren't building alternatives because they trust each other more. They're building them because they've stopped trusting anyone completely. Gold becomes the neutral reserve. Local currencies become the pragmatic choice. And the dollar, still dominant, still essential, starts feeling less like the only option and more like one option among many. Trust doesn't collapse overnight. It fades, quietly, imperceptibly, until one day you realize it's gone.
Loop 15. The Belt and Road Corridor. China's Belt and Road Initiative isn't just infrastructure. It's creating a trade network independent of Western financial systems. Roads, railways, ports, built with Chinese loans denominated in yuan, connecting Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Physical infrastructure to move goods without relying on US-controlled shipping lanes or dollar-based financing. Along these corridors, financial infrastructure emerges. Banks settling in yuan, payment systems bypassing SWIFT, trade agreements using gold or local currencies as reserves. Not conspiracy, economic logic. If China builds the roads, it makes sense for China's currency to flow along them. But the effect is profound. Every nation integrating into Belt and Road becomes less dependent on dollars, more aligned with Beijing's financial ecosystem. The corridor isn't just moving goods, it's moving the center of gravity in global trade. Loop 16. The sanctions boomerang. Sanctions were supposed to be precision tools, pressure adversaries without war. But sanctions against Russia revealed something uncomfortable. They work, but they also accelerate de-dollarization. When Russian banks were cut from SWIFT, Russia didn't collapse. It adapted, and in adapting, proved that life outside the dollar system, while difficult, is possible.
Now every nation that might someday face sanctions, and that's many nations, has seen the playbook. Build alternative payment systems, diversify reserves, reduce dollar dependence before you're forced to. The US used its financial system as a weapon, and in doing so, taught the world to build shields. Loop 17. The youth don't notice. If you're under 30, none of this feels unusual. You've never known a world where the dollar was unquestionably supreme. You've grown up during China's rise, BRICS expansion, conversations about currency alternatives. To you, multipolarity is normal. The idea that one country's currency should dominate global trade seems quaint. That generational shift matters. The people who will run central banks, finance ministries, and corporations in 20 years don't carry the same assumptions about dollar primacy. To them, the gold corridor isn't a threat. It's just another system. And systems, once normalized, become permanent. Loop 18. The dollar stays strong. For now. Here's the paradox. Despite everything, BRICS, gold accumulation, alternative payment systems, the dollar is still the world's dominant currency, and probably will be for decades. Why? Because there's no viable replacement. The yuan is too controlled by Beijing, the euro too fragmented, gold too illiquid for modern trade volumes. Dollar dominance isn't ending, it's softening. The world is building systems that reduce dependence without eliminating it, and that's almost worse. Slow erosion is harder to respond to than sudden crisis. You can't rally support against gradual decline. You can't pass emergency legislation for a problem that won't fully materialize for 20 years. The dollar stays strong, but the foundation quietly weakens. And by the time cracks become obvious, it might be too late to repair them. Loop 19. Li Wei retires. Li Wei, the analyst who wrote that memo in 2008, is retiring. He's spent 2 decades watching his recommendations become reality. China's gold reserves quintupled. The yuan is accepted in dozens of countries. Alternative payment systems operational. He doesn't feel victorious. He feels exhausted. The world he helped build is more fragmented, uncertain, prone to currency conflicts than when he started. The dollar system had problems, but it had stability, predictability. Now everything is in flux. Li Wei wonders if the world is better off, or if they've just traded one set of problems for another. He doesn't have an answer. Neither does anyone else. Loop 20. The next generation builds. While Li Wei retires, a new generation rises. Analysts, economists, policymakers, building on the foundation he helped lay. They're designing better payment systems, more efficient gold settlement mechanisms, digital currencies combining fiat flexibility with commodity neutrality. They're not trying to destroy the dollar. They're trying to create a world where no single currency has absolute power, where trade can continue even if one system fails, where economic sovereignty doesn't depend on political alignment. Not revolution, evolution. Slow, messy, incomplete, but happening and irreversible. How the gold corridor actually works. The structure simplified. Layer 1. Gold reserves. Central banks in BRICS nations accumulate gold aggressively, not to back currencies directly, there's no modern gold standard, but to create neutral reserve assets outside any single nation's control. Gold doesn't earn interest, doesn't grow, but holds value across centuries and can't be printed, frozen, or sanctioned. When Russia's foreign reserves froze in 2022, its gold reserves were untouchable. Physical gold, stored domestically, can't be seized by foreign governments. Nations buy gold, quietly, consistently, building reserves that provide financial independence. Layer 2. Bilateral currency swaps. BRICS nations signed dozens of bilateral currency swap agreements. These allow two countries to trade directly in their own currencies, without converting to dollars first. China and Brazil settle trade in yuan and reals. Central banks agree to exchange currencies at predetermined rates, bypassing dollars entirely. Reduces transaction costs, eliminates exchange rate risk, removes exposure to US monetary policy. Not seamless, lower liquidity than dollar markets, but works, and the more it's used, the smoother it becomes. Layer 3. Commodity-backed settlements. Oil, gold, wheat, copper. Tangible, valuable, universally desired. BRICS nations explore settling trade using commodities as exchange mediums. Russia exports oil. China exports electronics. Instead of both converting to dollars, Russia accepts yuan, converts to gold on Shanghai's exchange, then sells for rubles or holds as reserves. Triangular trade bypassing dollars at every step. Still developing, but infrastructure exists, legal frameworks in place, custodial services operational. Layer 4. Alternative payment rails. SWIFT, the dominant international payment messaging system, is Western-controlled. When Russia was cut from SWIFT, it proved global finance access is conditional. BRICS nations build alternatives. Russia has SPFS, China has CIPS, India develops its own systems. Not as widely adopted as SWIFT, but functional and expanding. Nations fearing sanctions or wanting payment redundancy integrate these systems into financial infrastructure. Every transaction through CIPS instead of SWIFT is a transaction not requiring Western approval. Layer 5. The digital yuan. China's central bank digital currency allows instant settlement of international transactions without intermediaries. No correspondent banks, no multi-day clearing. Direct peer-to-peer value transfer. Digital yuan integrates into Belt and Road projects, cross-border trade agreements, currency swap mechanisms. Fast, cheap, doesn't require dollars. As more nations adopt compatible digital currency systems, the need for dollar-based settlement diminishes. Layer 6. Energy as anchor. Just as the petrodollar system built on oil priced in dollars, the gold corridor anchors with energy priced in alternative currencies. Russia's oil and gas, Middle Eastern crude, African resources, all increasingly available in yuan, rubles, or settled through barter and commodity swaps. Energy is the most critical commodity in the global economy. If energy trade doesn't require dollars, nothing else does either. How it connects. Imagine a Chinese company buying Russian oil. Transaction invoiced in yuan. Payment processed through CIPS, bypassing SWIFT. Russia receives yuan, which it can hold as reserves, convert to rubles through currency swap, exchange for gold on Shanghai Gold Exchange, use to buy Chinese goods. No dollars involved at any step. Scale that across dozens of nations, hundreds of billions in trade, thousands of daily transactions. The dollar isn't being attacked, it's being bypassed, quietly, efficiently, and increasingly by choice. Who loses? The shift hurts real people in concrete, personal ways. The American middle class. You worked hard, saved diligently, built a modest retirement fund, played by the rules. But the rules are changing. As BRICS nations reduce dollar holdings, demand for US Treasury bonds weakens. Interest rates rise. Your mortgage refinance costs more. Car loan more expensive. Credit card interest climbs. Inflation, fed by reduced global dollar absorption, erodes savings. The $200,000 you set aside for retirement doesn't stretch as far as planned. You didn't do anything wrong. You're caught in the crossfire of a global economic shift most people don't realize is happening. The retiree on fixed income. You're 68, living on Social Security and a small pension. Every month, careful budgeting, groceries, utilities, medicine. But prices keep climbing. Not dramatically, steadily. Medications that cost $40 last year are $55 now. The grocery bill that was $300 is $420. Your income doesn't adjust. Social Security increases are tied to inflation metrics that don't capture real cost rises you experience daily. You're not living, you're surviving. And every year it gets harder. The reason traces to monetary dynamics shaped by decisions in Shanghai, Moscow, and Riyadh. But you'll never hear it explained that way. You'll just keep cutting corners, skipping meals, choosing between medicine and heat. The factory worker who never came back. The factory closed in 2012. You were told it was temporary. Restructuring, cost-cutting. It would reopen. It didn't. Jobs moved overseas to countries where labor was cheaper and currency dynamics made exports more competitive. You retrained, took classes, applied everywhere. But the economy that existed when you started working, where a high school diploma and strong back could build middle-class life, that economy is gone. Now you drive rideshare, deliver packages, piece together income from gigs without benefits, stability, or dignity. The gold corridor won't bring your factory back. A weaker dollar might make American manufacturing more competitive, but the infrastructure is gone. Supply chains dismantled, skills lost. You're a casualty of structural shift that started decades before BRICS became a headline. The small nation with dollar debt. You're a finance minister in a small African nation. Your country borrowed heavily in dollars to build infrastructure, roads, schools, hospitals. Now the dollar is strengthening against your local currency. Your debt burden, denominated in dollars, balloons, even though you haven't borrowed more. You're forced to cut spending. Education budgets slashed. Healthcare reduced. Infrastructure projects abandoned. Your citizens suffer. And they blame you, not the global monetary system that made borrowing in dollars seem like the only option. BRICS offers alternatives: yuan-denominated loans, commodity-backed financing. But switching systems mid-crisis is like changing engines on a plane in flight. Possible, but risky and destabilizing. You're trapped. And the gold corridor, which might offer long-term relief, does nothing to help you today. The US government. Even the dollar's issuer feels pain. For decades, the US borrowed cheaply because the world needed dollars and bought treasury bonds. That demand kept interest rates low and allowed the government to run deficits without immediate consequences. But as BRICS nations reduce treasury holdings and build alternative reserves, demand weakens, interest rates rise, the cost of servicing US debt climbs. More of the federal budget goes to interest payments, less available for infrastructure, education, defense, social programs. Politicians don't frame it this way, they blame each other. Fiscal irresponsibility, entitlement spending, tax cuts. But underneath political theatre is structural reality. The world doesn't need as many dollars as it used to, and that changes the math on everything. The silent imbalance. There's no single moment when the system breaks, no dramatic crash, no Black Tuesday. Just a slow, grinding realization that something fundamental has shifted. The velocity problem. By 2028, economists notice something strange. The velocity of money, the rate at which dollars circulate through the economy, is slowing. Why? Because fewer dollars circulate globally. BRICS trade that used to require dollar conversion now happens in local currencies. Oil transactions that cycled through New York banks now settle in Shanghai. Dollars that used to flow outward, lubricating global commerce, stay inside the US economy. When money moves slower, economic activity stagnates. The Federal Reserve responds by printing more money, but that just adds to the problem. More dollars circulating slower, chasing the same goods. Inflation rises, growth stalls. Stagflation becomes the new normal. The bond market shudders. In 2029, a routine Treasury bond auction fails to attract enough buyers. Not a crisis, yet, but a signal. Foreign central banks, which once reliably bought US debt, are no longer as interested. They're holding more gold, more yuan, more of their own currencies in bilateral swap agreements. The US Treasury has to offer higher interest rates to attract buyers, which increases borrowing costs, which pressures the federal budget, which forces spending cuts or tax increases. The political fallout is immediate, but the structural cause, reduced global dollar dependence, is barely mentioned. The commodity shock. In 2030, a major Middle Eastern oil producer announces it will no longer accept dollars for crude sales. Yuan, euros, or gold only. The announcement triggers a 15% spike in oil prices, not from supply disruptions, but because markets realize the petrodollar system is no longer absolute. American consumers feel it at the pump within days. $4.50 per gallon becomes $5.20, then $5.80. Politicians scramble, blame OPEC, blame speculators, blame environmentalists. But the real cause is structural. The architecture that made oil cheap for Americans is eroding. And once that architecture is gone, it's not coming back. The realization. There's a moment, not precise, not universally acknowledged, but felt, when it becomes clear that dollar dominance is no longer taken for granted. Not collapse. The dollar is still the world's most important currency, but no longer the only currency that matters. In that shift, the entire economic order Americans have lived under for 50 years begins to crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily. Let's talk about what happens when the United States Treasury Department realizes what's being built. The realization doesn't come suddenly. It's not a single alarming report that lands on someone's desk. It's gradual, incremental, data points accumulating until a pattern becomes undeniable. First, the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control notices minor irregularities in tracking sanctioned trade flows. Transactions that should be visible in dollar clearing data aren't appearing. Second, the Federal Reserve's International Finance Division observes that demand for dollars from certain emerging economies is declining slightly, not cratering, just 1 to 2% below projected levels. Third, intelligence briefings mention increased coordination between BRICS central banks on technical monetary matters. The specifics are vague, but the frequency of meetings is increasing. Fourth, academic papers start appearing, cautious, hedged, technical, but consistently raising the same question. How durable is dollar dominance if viable alternatives emerge? None of these data points individually suggests crisis, but collectively they tell a story. The story is a parallel system is being constructed, quietly, methodically, without fanfare. And the people constructing it have learned from past mistakes. They're not launching a new Bretton Woods. They're not announcing a grand vision. They're not giving speeches about ending dollar hegemony. They're just building infrastructure. Technical, boring, unglamorous infrastructure, which is exactly how you build something the incumbent power can't easily stop. Because how do you sanction technical standards development? How do you penalize nations for establishing shared custody protocols? How do you retaliate against central banks for diversifying their reserve holdings? You can't. Not without proving the exact point that motivates the infrastructure in the first place, that dollar access can be weaponized. The Treasury officials understand this, which is why, in a classified briefing in early 2024, the assessment is blunt. We cannot prevent this infrastructure from being built. Attempts to do so would accelerate its adoption. Our optimal strategy is to ensure US financial infrastructure remains competitive on cost, speed, and reliability. If we maintain superior service, users will prefer dollar systems regardless of alternatives. If we don't, no amount of diplomatic pressure will preserve market share. This represents a fundamental shift in thinking. For 70 years, dollar dominance was assumed, maintained through network effects and the absence of alternatives. Now it has to be earned, maintained through competitive advantage rather than structural inevitability. And competitive advantage requires discipline, requires restraint, requires accepting constraints on using the dollar system as a geopolitical tool, which is a difficult adjustment for any hegemon. Let's talk about what happens when someone tries to calculate the total economic impact of the gold corridor. An economist at a Washington think tank, someone with a PhD from MIT, experience at the World Bank, and a reputation for rigorous quantitative analysis, takes on the question. Her mandate: model the potential effects on US borrowing costs if gold-backed settlement reaches 10%, 20%, and 30% of BRICS trade. The model is complex. It has to account for reduced dollar demand from trade settlement, second-order effects on treasury purchases, potential currency adjustments, market psychology and confidence effects, feedback loops between borrowing costs and fiscal policy. She works on it for 3 months, runs hundreds of simulations, tests different assumptions. The results surprise her. At 10% penetration, gold settling 10% of BRICS trade, US borrowing costs increase by 8 to 12 basis points. Annual fiscal impact: $24 to $36 billion in additional interest payments. Minimal currency adjustment: dollar weakens by 0.5 to 1%. At 20% penetration, US borrowing costs increase by 22 to 31 basis points. Annual fiscal impact: $66 to $93 billion in additional interest payments. Moderate currency adjustment: dollar weakens by 1.5 to 2.5%. At 30% penetration, US borrowing costs increase by 41 to 58 basis points. Annual fiscal impact: $123 to $174 billion in additional interest payments. Significant currency adjustment. Dollar weakens by 3 to 4.5%. She publishes the paper. It gets attention in policy circles. But here's what the model can't capture: threshold effects. The paper assumes linear relationships. More gold settlement equals proportionally higher borrowing costs. But reality might not be linear. There might be a threshold, maybe at 15% penetration, maybe at 25%, where market psychology shifts, where the dollar is still dominant becomes the dollar is one option among several. And once that psychological shift happens, effects could accelerate non-linearly. Because confidence in reserve currencies isn't purely rational. It's partly self-fulfilling prophecy. People hold dollars because other people hold dollars. Countries price commodities in dollars because other countries expect dollar pricing. But if that expectation begins to crack, if enough participants start thinking, maybe we don't need to default to dollars, the shift could happen faster than linear models predict.
The Economist knows this. She includes a cautious note in the paper's limitations section. This analysis assumes gradual, proportional adjustment. However, reserve currency dynamics may exhibit threshold effects and non-linear transitions that are difficult to model quantitatively. Translation: we might be underestimating the risk, or we might be overestimating it. The uncertainty itself is the point. For 70 years, there was no uncertainty. Dollar dominance was stable, predictable, reliable. Now there's a scenario space, a range of possibilities, a future that depends on decisions not yet made. And uncertainty, for a hegemon accustomed to stability, feels like decline. Even if the actual outcome is something far more mundane. Adjustment to a multipolar world where the United States remains powerful, but not uniquely powerful. Let's talk about what happens in a Brazilian coffee exporter's office when their bank offers them a choice. The company exports 40,000 tons of coffee annually, mostly to Europe and Asia. Total export value, roughly $180 million per year. For decades, settlements were straightforward. European buyers paid in euros, which the company converted to Brazilian reals. Asian buyers paid in dollars, also converted to reals. Conversion fees, about 0.6%. Settlement time, 5 to 8 business days. Then, in late 2023, their bank sends a representative. We're now offering an alternative settlement option for your Chinese contracts, the representative explains. Instead of dollar payment routed through correspondent banks, we can facilitate gold-backed settlement through the bilateral BRICS framework. The company's finance director asks the obvious questions. How does it work? Your Chinese buyer's bank initiates a gold transfer from China's central bank custody account to Brazil's custody account. The Brazilian central bank then credits reais to your company's account at the current gold to real exchange rate. How long does it take? 48 to 72 hours typically, faster than dollar settlement. What are the fees? About 0.3%, roughly half of dollar conversion fees. What are the risks? The representative pauses. This is the important question. Currency risk is similar to dollar settlement. Gold to real exchange rates fluctuate. Custody risk is minimal. Both central banks have secure vault infrastructure. Political risk, that's harder to assess. If geopolitical tensions increase, we can't guarantee the system remains operational. The finance director thinks about this. On 40 million of Chinese sales, switching to gold settlement would save approximately $120,000 annually in fees and accelerate cash flow by 3 to 5 days. Not transformative, but meaningful. What percentage of our clients are using this option? He asks.
Currently, about 8% of eligible transactions, growing steadily. Can we use it for some contracts and dollars for others? Absolutely. You choose on a transaction-by-transaction basis. The finance director makes a decision. Let's try it for one shipment. See how it works. If the process is smooth, we'll consider expanding. This conversation, or variations of it, is happening in thousands of businesses across BRICS nations. Not dramatic conversions, not ideological commitments, just pragmatic businesses making pragmatic choices based on cost and efficiency. And each time a business chooses gold settlement for one transaction, the system proves itself a little more. The infrastructure becomes a little more normalized. The alternative becomes a little less alternative. Let's talk about what happens when India and UAE negotiate a gold-backed trade corridor. The two nations already have substantial trade, about $85 billion annually. Oil and gas flowing from UAE to India, pharmaceuticals, textiles, and agricultural products flowing back. Most of this trade settles in dollars, always has. But in 2024, they begin exploring an alternative. The negotiation happens in technical working groups, trade ministry officials, central bank representatives, logistics experts. The question they're trying to answer: can we create a dedicated India-UAE gold settlement corridor that handles the most frequent, highest volume transactions? The advantages would be significant. First, speed. India and UAE are in similar time zones. Real-time coordination is easier than coordinating across 12 time zones with intermediary banks. Second, familiarity. Both nations have deep historical ties to gold. Cultural comfort with gold as a store of value. Existing refinery and assaying infrastructure. Third, strategic alignment. Neither nation wants complete dependence on dollar systems that could be disrupted by US policy changes. But the challenges are real. Both nations need adequate gold reserves. India has about 800 tons. UAE has roughly 74 tons. For significant settlement volumes, UAE would need to acquire more. Both nations need secure, mutually recognized custody facilities. This means either building new infrastructure or establishing legal frameworks for shared access to existing vaults. Both nations need agreement on dispute resolution. If a technical glitch occurs, if gold purity is questioned, if weight verification is contested, who arbitrates? What court has jurisdiction? These aren't simple questions, but they're solvable questions. After 8 months of negotiations, they reach an agreement. A pilot program. 50 transactions over 12 months. Medium-sized commodity trades. Settle through gold, held in a shared custody arrangement in Singapore. The pilot will test technical feasibility. Can the custody and verification systems handle real transactions? Cost efficiency. Are total costs actually lower than dollar settlement? Risk management. Do unexpected problems emerge? If the pilot succeeds, they'll scale up. If it reveals problems, they'll adjust. This is how infrastructure gets built in the 21st century. Not through grand announcements and immediate rollout, through pilot programs, technical testing, incremental expansion, learning by doing. And if India-UAE succeeds, other bilateral pairs will follow the template. Brazil, South Africa, Russia, China, Indonesia, Iran. Each bilateral corridor strengthening the overall network. Each successful pilot proving that gold settlement isn't theoretical. It's operational. The meeting room in Moscow is not what you'd expect. It's not grand, not ornate. not filled with the kind of heavy symbolism you'd imagine when nations discuss the future of global finance. It's just functional. A long table, windows that let in cold light from a February afternoon. The kind of light that makes everything look slightly washed out, slightly grey. Around the table sit representatives from 5 nations. Not all of them are finance ministers. Some are central bank governors. Others are trade officials. One is a deputy minister whose portfolio includes strategic commodities. They've been meeting for 3 days. The conversation is technical, dry. The kind of language that would put most people to sleep within minutes. But if you listen closely, if you understand what's actually being discussed, you realize something profound is happening. They're not talking about gold as a commodity. They're talking about gold as infrastructure. One of the representatives, a Brazilian economist who spent 15 years working for the IMF before returning home, leans forward and places a document on the table. It's a proposal, 47 pages, dense with technical language, charts, trade flow projections. The title is simple: Bilateral Settlement Framework, Gold-Backed Trade Clearing Between BRICS Members. The Russian representative picks it up, flips through it slowly, doesn't say anything for almost 2 full minutes. Then, this changes the settlement timeline by how much? 72 hours average, the Brazilian economist replies, down from 9 days under swift routing through correspondent banks. And the dollar exposure? Eliminated entirely if both parties hold gold reserves in the shared custody system. The Chinese representative, a woman in her 50s who rarely speaks but takes meticulous notes, looks up. The shared custody system, she says quietly. That requires trust infrastructure we haven't built yet. Correct, the Brazilian economist says, which is why this is a 10-year build-out, not immediate implementation. There's a pause. The South African representative, younger, maybe early 40s, trained at the London School of Economics, leans back in his chair. 10 years, he says. That's assuming no disruption to current trade arrangements. What happens if dollar sanctions accelerate? Then the timeline compresses, the Brazilian economist says, and we implement phases 1 through 3 in 36 months instead of 7 years. Another pause.
The Indian representative, an older man, grey hair, wire-rimmed glasses, speaks for the first time in nearly an hour. The Federal Reserve will notice this. They already have, the Russian representative says. They've known about preliminary discussions since 2021. And their response? Public, dismissive. Private, monitoring closely. They understand what this means if it scales. The Indian representative nods slowly. If it scales, he repeats. That's the question, isn't it? Whether this remains a bilateral arrangement between 2 or 3 members, or becomes actual infrastructure. Infrastructure requires standardization, the Chinese representative says, which requires agreement on weight, purity, custody protocols, dispute resolution mechanisms. None of that exists yet in harmonized form. Correct, the Brazilian economist says, which is why the proposal includes a technical working group with representatives from all 5 central banks. 6-month timeline to produce a preliminary standards document.
The South African representative picks up the proposal, reads a section, sets it down. The preliminary standards document, he says, that gets reviewed by who? Each nation's monetary authority independently? Or is there a collective approval mechanism? Collective, the Brazilian economist says. Consensus-based. Any member can veto provisions they consider incompatible with their domestic monetary framework. Then this will take longer than 10 years, the South African representative says. Consensus among 5 nations with different political systems, different banking structures, different reserve management philosophies. Which is why the proposal is modular, the Brazilian economist interrupts gently. Each bilateral pair can implement independently. The full 5-nation system is the end goal, but 2 nations can begin settlement tomorrow if they agree on custody and weight verification. The room goes quiet. Outside, the February light is fading, the kind of fade that happens slowly in winter, where afternoon becomes evening without a clear transition point. The Russian representative stands, walks to the window, looks out at the city. When we discuss this publicly, he says, not turning around, the narrative will be about sovereignty, about reducing dependency on Western financial systems, about protecting against sanctions. He turns back to the table. That narrative is true, but it's not the whole truth. What's the whole truth? The Indian representative asks. The Russian representative sits back down. The whole truth, he says, is that we're watching the United States make a choice. They can maintain dollar dominance, or they can maintain the current sanctions regime. They cannot do both indefinitely. Why not? Because sanctions work by threatening access to dollar clearing. But if dollar clearing becomes a vulnerability instead of a necessity, the threat loses force. And once enough of the global economy realizes that alternatives exist, not perfect alternatives, not effortless alternatives, but viable alternatives, the equilibrium shifts. The Chinese representative closes her notebook. Viable alternatives, she says. That's the phrase that matters. Not superior, not easier, just viable. Correct, the Russian representative says. Viable means 51% solutions. Good enough to justify the switching cost. That's what this proposal creates. A 51% solution to dollar settlement dependency. The Brazilian economist picks up the document. The question, he says, is whether we're ready to commit to building that solution. Because once we start, once the technical working groups begin, once the custody protocols are drafted, once the first bilateral settlement happens and gets reported, the narrative becomes real, and reversing becomes significantly harder. No one speaks for almost a minute. The South African representative breaks the silence. I'll take this back to Pretoria, he says, but I'll need 3 months to brief our monetary authority, our trade ministry, and our finance committee. This isn't something I can recommend without full institutional review. 3 months is acceptable, the Brazilian economist says. We're not proposing immediate action. We're proposing serious evaluation of whether serious action makes sense. The Indian representative nods. I'll do the same, he says. Full institutional review. But I want to be clear about one thing. He looks around the table. If we proceed with this, if we actually build this system, we will be blamed for fragmenting the global financial order. The narrative will be that BRICS nations chose to break the system rather than work within it. That narrative is already being written, the Russian representative says quietly. The question is whether we allow others to write our chapter, or whether we write it ourselves. The meeting continues for another 40 minutes. Technical details, implementation timelines, communication protocols for the next phase. But the real decision has already been made. Not explicitly, not with a vote or a formal declaration, but in the way the representatives pack their documents, in the way they shake hands before leaving, in the tone of voice when they say, "We'll be in touch." Something has shifted. Not from dollar dominance to gold-backed trade, not yet, but from impossible to complex. And in geopolitics, that shift, from impossible to merely complex, is where empires begin to adjust their calculations. The Brazilian economist's hands rest flat on the table. His fingers are slightly spread, as if he's steadying himself against something invisible. He's been in meetings like this before, dozens of them, sometimes in Basel at Bank for International Settlements gatherings, sometimes in Washington, back when he worked for the IMF, sometimes in Sao Paulo, in conference rooms overlooking Avenida Paulista. But this one feels different, not because of what's being said. The words are familiar: settlement infrastructure, custody protocols, bilateral clearing arrangements. He's heard these phrases 1,000 times. What's different is the context. For the first time in his career, he's discussing monetary architecture that doesn't assume dollar centrality. Not as a theoretical exercise, not as an academic paper exploring alternative scenarios, as a real policy proposal with real implementation timelines. The weight of that hits him suddenly, sitting in this Moscow conference room, watching the other representatives process the same realization. They're not planning to replace the dollar. They're planning to build something that exists alongside it. And if it works, if this infrastructure actually gets built, if nations actually use it, if trade actually flows through it, then the world's monetary system will have fundamentally changed. Not overnight, but changed nonetheless. 3 months later, the Brazilian economist receives an encrypted email. The subject line, "Pretoria Review Complete." He opens it, reads carefully. The South African government has completed its institutional review. The Monetary Authority, Trade Ministry, and Finance Committee have all signed off. South Africa will participate in the technical working group, not full commitment to implementation, but commitment to serious preparation, which, in diplomacy, is how yes begins. Over the next 2 weeks, similar messages arrive from New Delhi, Beijing, Moscow. All positive, all cautious, all framed as further study rather than definite commitment. But the Brazilian economist understands what's happening. The project is moving forward. 6 months after the Moscow meeting, the technical working group holds its first formal session. The location is neutral: Singapore, a city-state with no geopolitical allegiances that might compromise the proceedings. The session lasts 5 days. The participants are not politicians, they're technicians. Central bank staffers who understand custody protocols, trade finance specialists who know settlement mechanics, legal experts who can draft dispute resolution frameworks. Their job is unglamorous: create a standards document that allows gold-backed bilateral settlement to function reliably. The document needs to specify acceptable gold purity: 99.5%, 99.95%, 99.99%. Weight verification procedures, independent assayers, shared equipment, blockchain authentication, custody arrangements, shared vaults, bilateral vaults, third-party custodians, settlement timing, T+1, T+2, real-time, dispute resolution, arbitration, ICJ referral, bilateral negotiation, fee structures, who pays custody costs, verification costs, insurance premiums. Every decision involves trade-offs. Higher purity standards mean fewer eligible gold bars, but greater confidence in value. Faster settlement means higher operational costs, but better cash flow for businesses. Third-party custodians reduce bilateral trust requirements, but introduce new counterparty risks. The technical specialists debate these trade-offs methodically. No drama, no grand speeches, just careful analysis of costs, benefits, and risk factors. By day 5, they have a draft. It's 184 pages long, dense, filled with technical specifications, flowcharts, risk matrices. Not inspiring, but functional. And functionality in infrastructure matters more than inspiration. The draft gets circulated to the 5 central banks for review. Comments and revisions take another 4 months. The final standards document is 218 pages. It establishes 99.95% minimum purity, London Good Delivery Standard, T+2 settlement, trade date plus 2 business days, shared custody in designated neutral jurisdictions, Switzerland, Singapore, UAE as initial options, independent assayer verification with mutual recognition of certified testing facilities, binding arbitration for disputes under UNCITRAL rules, proportional fee sharing between trading partners. 4 of the 5 BRICS nations ratify the standards within 3 months.
The 5th takes another 6 months, but eventually ratifies with minor reservations. The infrastructure is ready. Now it just needs to be used. The first bilateral gold settlement happens 18 months after the Moscow meeting. It's not announced. There's no press conference, no ceremony. Just a technical adjustment in how 2 nations clear a shipment of industrial machinery. The exporting nation, one of the BRICS members, sends the equipment. The importing nation, another BRICS member, transfers physical gold from its central bank vault to the exporter's designated custody account. Weight, 247 kilograms. Purity, 99.95%, London Good Delivery Standard. Settlement time, 14 hours. That's it. No dollars involved, no SWIFT routing, no correspondent banking fees, just gold moving from one sovereign vault to another, representing payment for goods that have already been delivered. The transaction gets recorded in both nations' central bank ledgers, but it doesn't appear in international financial reporting the way dollar transactions do. There's no centralized clearinghouse tracking every movement, no public database showing volumes. It's essentially invisible to outside observers, unless they're looking very carefully. The Federal Reserve is looking very carefully. Not because one gold settlement matters. One settlement is a rounding error, a curiosity, an experiment that may or may not be repeated. But 6 months later, there are 11 more settlements, then 24. Then, by the end of the 2nd year, over 300 bilateral settlements using gold instead of dollars. Still small in absolute terms, still a tiny fraction of total BRICS trade, less than 2%, but growing, and more importantly, proving the concept works. The technical working group, the one established in that Moscow meeting, has been meeting quarterly.
They've produced the 218-page standards document, implementation guidelines, best practices documentation. 4 of the 5 BRICS nations have ratified the standards. The 5th is still under internal review, but expected to ratify within 6 months. Meanwhile, something unexpected happens. Other nations start paying attention. Not the G7 nations. They remain publicly dismissive. A niche arrangement, one US Treasury official calls it in a briefing, not scalable beyond a handful of commodity transactions. But mid-tier economies, nations that do significant trade with BRICS members but have no particular allegiance to dollar dominance, start asking questions. Could they join this system? Could they hold gold reserves in the shared custody framework? Could they settle their own bilateral trade using this infrastructure? The answer, technically, is yes.
The standards document doesn't restrict membership to BRICS nations. Any country with a functioning central bank and adequate vault security can participate. But there's an unwritten understanding. This system exists because the founding members share a strategic interest in reducing dollar dependency. New members need to demonstrate that same interest, which means this isn't a free-for-all. It's a coalition, and coalitions have entry requirements. By year 4, the system includes 12 nations. Not all of them are BRICS members. 3 are Southeast Asian economies. 2 are Middle Eastern oil exporters. 1 is a Central Asian republic that does heavy infrastructure trade with China. Total trade volume settled through gold, still less than 8% of total trade among participating nations. But the trajectory is clear, and in Washington, that trajectory is no longer being dismissed. It's being monitored. A task force within the Treasury Department progresses quarterly reports tracking gold settlement volumes, participating nations, and potential impacts on dollar demand. The reports are classified, but the conclusions leak. Alternative settlement infrastructure is operational and expanding. While current volumes remain minimal, growth rates suggest potential scaling to economically significant levels within 7 to 10 years. Recommend continued monitoring and assessment of policy responses. Translation: this isn't going away. We need to figure out how to respond. But how do you respond? Sanctions against nations using gold settlement would validate the exact concerns that motivated the system's creation, would prove that dollar access can be weaponized. Diplomatic pressure carries similar risks. Push too hard and you accelerate adoption rather than preventing it. The Federal Reserve publishes a working paper titled Alternative Settlement Systems and Dollar Dominance, a Risk Assessment. The paper is careful, measured. It doesn't use alarmist language, but the conclusion is unambiguous. If alternative settlement infrastructure continues to expand among major trading economies, particularly in commodity-heavy sectors, the structural demand for dollars could decline incrementally over a multi-decade period. While unlikely to eliminate dollar dominance, such a decline would reduce the United States' ability to use financial access as a geopolitical tool and could increase the cost of federal borrowing by 30 to 70 basis points, depending on the scale of transition. 30 to 70 basis points. That sounds small. But on $30 trillion of federal debt, 30 basis points means $90 billion per year in additional interest costs. 70 basis points means over $200 billion per year. Not catastrophic, but not negligible. And that's assuming the transition stays gradual, stays contained, doesn't accelerate. But transitions rarely stay gradual once they reach critical mass. By year 6, the gold settlement system has expanded to 21 nations. Trade volume settled through gold, 18% of total trade among participating members. And here's where the second-order effects begin.
Because once 18% of trade clears outside the dollar system, other nations start asking a different question. Not should we join this system, but what happens if we don't? If your major trading partners are increasingly settling in gold and you're still dependent on dollar clearing, you're introducing currency conversion costs and settlement delays that your competitors don't face, which means you're at a structural disadvantage. So you start considering participation, not because you prefer gold to dollars, but because the network effects are shifting. And once network effects shift, the equilibrium changes faster than anyone expects. Here's the thing about empires that people forget. They don't usually collapse. They adjust. The Roman Empire didn't vanish overnight. It fragmented, split into eastern and western halves, persisted in diminished form for centuries. The British Empire didn't end with a bang. It transitioned, became a commonwealth, retained influence through softer mechanisms. The American financial empire, if we can call it that, is following a similar pattern, not collapsing, adjusting. What we're watching with the BRICS Gold Corridor isn't the end of dollar dominance. It's the beginning of dollar coexistence with alternative systems. And coexistence is actually harder to analyze than collapse, because collapse gives you clear before and after points. You can measure it, define it, say, this was the moment everything changed. But coexistence is gradual, ambiguous. It's a slow erosion of exclusive privilege rather than a sudden loss of power, which means you can't point to a single day and say, here's where the dollar stopped being the global reserve currency. Because it doesn't stop. It just becomes less universal. And less universal means less profitable for the United States. Think about what dollar dominance actually provides. First, it creates demand for US Treasury bonds. Because if you need dollars for trade, you need a place to store those dollars between transactions. And treasuries are the safest, most liquid dollar-denominated asset. That demand keeps treasury yields lower than they would otherwise be, which means the US government can borrow more cheaply. How much more cheaply? Estimates vary, but most economists put the exorbitant privilege discount somewhere between 30 and 100 basis points, depending on market conditions. On a $30 trillion debt, that's $90 to $300 billion per year in reduced interest costs. Second, dollar dominance gives the United States geopolitical leverage. If your economy depends on dollar clearing and the US can threaten to cut off that access, you have to consider American preferences when making policy decisions. Not always, not automatically, but more often than you would if you had viable alternatives. That leverage is worth what? Hard to quantify precisely, but look at the sanctions regime. Look at how many nations have modified their behavior, reduced trade with sanctioned states, adjusted foreign policy positions, accepted diplomatic compromises, because the alternative was losing dollar access. That's not military power, it's financial power, and it's been extraordinarily effective for 70 years. But here's what happens when parallel infrastructure emerges. You don't lose that power overnight, you lose it transactionally. Each time a nation chooses to settle trade in gold instead of dollars, that's one transaction where US leverage doesn't apply. Each time a nation builds reserves in gold instead of treasuries, that's one pool of capital that doesn't drive down US borrowing costs. Individually, these shifts are insignificant. Collectively, over 20 years, they reshape the entire international system. And the United States has to adapt, which means higher borrowing costs, reduced geopolitical leverage, more negotiation, less dictation. Not weakness, just less dominance. And the psychology of that adjustment is difficult. Because the post-1971 order wasn't sold as temporary American dominance. It was sold as the natural order of global finance. The idea that dollars are the global reserve currency felt inevitable, permanent, the way things just are. But nothing in economics is permanent. Systems that seem inevitable today were constructed by specific decisions made by specific people in specific moments. And systems that were constructed can be deconstructed. Not easily, not quickly, but gradually, transactionally, through the accumulation of a million small choices by actors who see better options emerging. 20 years from now, someone will write a history of this moment. They'll look back at the BRICS Gold Corridor and debate whether it was the beginning of a new monetary order or just a footnote in the longer story of dollar dominance. Historians will argue. Some will say it was inevitable, that American overreach made alternatives necessary, that the system was always fragile, that gold-backed settlement was just waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. Others will say it was overblown, that the dollar remained dominant, that gold settlements were niche, that the infrastructure never truly scaled beyond regional arrangements. Both sides will be partially right, because the truth is more complex than either narrative allows. The BRICS Gold Corridor didn't replace the dollar. It didn't need to. It just created space for something other than the dollar to exist. And in that space, the world became slightly more multipolar, slightly less centered on American preferences, slightly more negotiated. Not dramatically, just incrementally. And incremental changes over decades reshape the world as thoroughly as dramatic ones. The people in that Moscow meeting room, the Brazilian economist, the Russian trade official, the Chinese central banker, the Indian monetary expert, the South African finance deputy, they didn't set out to end an empire. They set out to solve a technical problem. How do you clear cross-border trade when the dominant clearing system can be weaponized against you? And the answer they found was old. Older than fiat currency, older than central banks, older than the concept of monetary policy. Gold. Not because gold is better, but because gold is neutral. No single nation controls it. No single institution can restrict access to it. No algorithm determines its supply. It just is. And in a world where trust between great powers is declining, neutrality has value. Not total value, not irreplaceable value, but enough value to justify building infrastructure around it. And once that infrastructure exists, it doesn't matter whether most trade uses it. What matters is that it's there, an option, a fallback, a quiet reminder that exclusive systems eventually generate their own alternatives. The lights in the Moscow conference room have been turned off. The representatives have gone home. The documents have been filed. The technical working groups continue their meetings, quarterly at first, then twice a year, then annually once the standards are stable. The system grows slowly, settles into patterns, becomes less controversial as it becomes more routine. And somewhere in Washington, in a Federal Reserve office with windows overlooking Constitution Avenue, an economist updates a spreadsheet. It tracks the percentage of global trade settled outside dollar systems. The number is still small, but it's no longer negligible, and the trend line no longer points towards zero. It points toward coexistence, which is not the same as defeat, but it's not the same as dominance either. It's something in between. The future that no one quite expected, but everyone, in hindsight, could have seen coming. If they'd been paying attention to the small things, the technical meetings, the bilateral settlements, the quiet adjustments in how nations manage their reserves, the kind of things that don't make headlines until they've already reshaped the world. Outside that Federal Reserve office, the city continues its rhythms. Cars move along Constitution Avenue, tourists photograph monuments, congressional staffers hurry between buildings. Life goes on. The dollar remains important. Treasuries still trade. American financial institutions still dominate global markets. But the ground has shifted. Imperceptibly to most, but shifted nonetheless. And once ground shifts, you can't unshift it by pretending it hasn't moved. You can only adapt to the new terrain, which is what empires do when they're smart, when they're flexible, when they understand that permanence is an illusion and adaptation is survival. The economist closes the spreadsheet, saves the file, shuts down his computer. Tomorrow there will be another meeting, another report, another assessment of how the world is changing. But for now, the work is done. The data is recorded. The trend is noted. And somewhere in Moscow, in Beijing, in Brasilia, in New Delhi, in Pretoria, other economists are closing their own spreadsheets, recording their own data, noting their own trends. All of them tracking the same slow, quiet, irreversible transformation. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but happens anyway. Let's talk about what happens when a European luxury goods manufacturer discovers the BRICS gold settlement system. The company, let's call them Maison D, produces high-end leather goods, handbags, luggage, accessories. They source exotic leathers from multiple countries, including Brazil and South Africa. For decades, payment was simple: wire transfer in euros, converted to dollars if needed, routed through major European banks. Reliable, predictable, expensive. Fees on a typical $500,000 leather shipment from Brazil, about $2,800 in conversion and transfer costs. Settlement time, 6 to 8 business days. Then, in late 2025, their Brazilian supplier mentions an alternative. We can settle through the bilateral gold system, the supplier says. Lower fees, faster clearing, but you'd need to work with a bank that has access to the infrastructure. Maison D's CFO investigates. Turns out, 3 major European banks now offer gold-backed settlement services, not widely advertised, available mainly to clients doing substantial emerging market trade. The CFO runs the numbers. Switching to gold settlement for their Brazilian and South African leather purchases would save approximately $47,000 annually in fees and accelerate cash flow by eliminating a week of settlement delay. But there's a question that bothers him. If we start using this system, he asks the bank representative, are we making a political statement? Are we signaling opposition to dollar dominance? The representative smiles. You're making a business decision, she says. The system exists. It functions. It saves money. Whether you use it is purely pragmatic. Maison D decides to try one transaction. A shipment of crocodile hides from a South African tannery. Value $320,000. Settlement through gold. Custody transfer in Singapore. Payment credited to the tannery's account in Rand within 52 hours. The process is smooth. No glitches, no delays, no unexpected complications. The savings are real. Fees $890, compared to the usual $1,760 for dollar settlement. 6 months later, Maison D is settling 60% of its emerging market purchases through gold. Not because they care about geopolitics, because the math works. And this pattern, European luxury brands, Asian electronics manufacturers, North American commodity traders, all discovering that gold settlement offers measurable cost advantages, is replicating across dozens of industries. Nobody's making grand announcements. They're just quietly choosing the cheaper, faster option. Which is how systems change in capitalist economies, not through ideology, through ledgers. Let's talk about what happens when an American pension fund manager realizes that some of their international equity holdings are being affected by gold settlement trends. The fund manages $140 billion in assets, mostly domestic US equities and bonds, but about $18 billion in international emerging market exposure. The manager, a quantitative analyst with a PhD in economics, is reviewing quarterly performance data when she notices something odd. Companies in her emerging market portfolio that do significant intra-BRICS trade are showing slightly better working capital metrics than comparable firms that trade primarily with Western markets. Days sales outstanding, 3 to 4 days lower. Cash conversion cycles, measurably shorter. At first, she assumes this is noise, random variation, sector-specific factors. But the pattern persists across quarters, across countries, across industries. She digs deeper, talks to CFOs at portfolio companies, reads annual reports carefully, examines cash flow statements, and she discovers these companies are increasingly using gold-backed settlement for their cross-border trade within the BRICS sphere, which means they're getting paid faster, paying suppliers faster, reducing working capital tied up in transit, which improves their cash flow metrics, which makes them slightly more attractive investments. She writes a memo to the fund's investment committee. Emerging market companies with significant BRICS trade exposure may outperform peers due to settlement infrastructure advantages. Recommend overweighting these segments in our EM allocation. The committee discusses this for an hour. Some members are skeptical. You're telling us that gold settlement, which handles maybe 5% of BRICS trade, is creating measurable performance differentials. Not dramatic differentials, she clarifies. Marginal improvements, maybe 20 to 30 basis points of additional return due to superior cash management. But compounded over time, that's meaningful. The committee approves a modest reallocation, shifting $400 million within their emerging market portfolio toward companies with high BRICS trade exposure. And here's where it gets interesting, because this pension fund isn't alone. Over the next 18 months, 5 other major institutional investors make similar reallocations. Total capital shifted, approximately $6 billion. That's still tiny in the context of global capital markets, a rounding error, but it creates a feedback loop. Companies with BRICS trade exposure start getting higher valuations, which means they can raise capital more easily, which means they can expand operations more aggressively, which means they do more BRICS trade, which further improves their working capital metrics. The system becomes self-reinforcing, not through grand design, through millions of individual actors, investors, executives, analysts, each making rational decisions based on their own metrics. And collectively, without coordinating, shifting capital toward infrastructure that challenges dollar dominance. Because the infrastructure works. Not perfectly, but well enough. Let's talk about what happens when a mid-career State Department official realizes that American diplomatic leverage is quietly eroding. She works in the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. Her portfolio, monitoring international financial architecture developments. For most of her career, this has been straightforward. The dollar-based system was stable. Challenges were theoretical. Alternatives were niche. But starting in 2024, she starts noticing changes. Nations that used to be very responsive to US diplomatic pressure on sanctions compliance are becoming less responsive. Not defiant, not openly resistant, just less immediately compliant. When the US requests cooperation on new sanctions measures, countries that used to agree within weeks now take months. When the US suggests policy adjustments, countries that used to accommodate now politely decline. It's subtle, gradual, easy to dismiss as normal diplomatic friction. But the pattern is consistent. She hypothesizes these nations are becoming less sensitive to threats of dollar access restriction because they have alternatives. Not perfect alternatives, not complete substitutes, but enough alternatives that losing dollar access wouldn't be existential. She writes a classified memo, declining efficacy of financial access as diplomatic lever, a preliminary assessment. The memo doesn't make dramatic claims. It just documents the pattern, provides data, suggests further study. But the implication is clear. American power is changing, not collapsing, just changing. From the ability to dictate outcomes through threat of exclusion to the need to negotiate outcomes through offering better terms than alternatives. Which is a profound shift. Not in military power, not in technological leadership, not in economic size, but in financial leverage. The memo circulates, gets discussed in interagency meetings, generates follow-up studies. But no clear policy response emerges. Because what's the response? Sanction countries for using gold settlement? That would validate their concerns and accelerate adoption. Pressure allies to avoid the system? That would strain relationships for marginal benefit. Try to build a competing alternative? The dollar already is the dominant system. Building a dollar alternative doesn't make sense. The State Department official eventually reaches a conclusion that she doesn't write in any official document, but shares with trusted colleagues over drinks. We're watching hegemonic transition in slow motion, not a dramatic collapse, just a gradual diffusion of financial power, and there's no policy lever that reverses it. We just have to adapt to being one important financial system instead of the only important financial system. Her colleagues nod. No one argues, because they've reached the same conclusion. Let's talk about what happens when a Chinese economics professor writes a textbook that normalizes gold-backed settlement. The textbook is titled International Trade Finance, Theory and Practice, 3rd edition. It's designed for undergraduate economics majors, standard material, letters of credit, currency hedging, correspondent banking, trade documentation. But the 3rd edition includes something new, an entire chapter on gold-backed bilateral settlement systems. The chapter is neutral, academic. It doesn't advocate for gold settlement or criticize dollar dominance. It just explains how gold settlement works mechanically, the historical precedents, gold standard, Bretton Woods, the contemporary infrastructure, BRICS corridor, bilateral arrangements, comparative advantages and disadvantages versus fiat currency settlement, case studies of specific transactions. The textbook gets adopted by universities across China, then across Southeast Asia, then in some African universities, eventually a few Latin American institutions. Within 3 years, approximately 400,000 students have read this chapter. And here's what that does. It normalizes the concept. Students who learn about gold settlement alongside traditional dollar settlement don't see it as alternative or radical. They see it as one option in a toolkit. When these students graduate and enter careers in trade finance, central banking, corporate treasury, they're comfortable with gold settlement. They've learned the mechanics. They understand the use cases. So when their employers ask, should we consider gold-backed settlement for this transaction, they don't react with skepticism or concern. They just analyze the cost-benefit trade-off, like they would for any financial decision. This educational normalization is happening simultaneously with infrastructure development. The infrastructure makes gold settlement possible. The education makes it unremarkable. And unremarkable is how alternatives become mainstream, not through revolutionary upheaval, through textbooks, training programs, professional certifications, and casual familiarity. By 2030, an entire generation of financial professionals in emerging economies has been trained to view dollar settlement and gold settlement as equally legitimate options. They have no ideological preference, just pragmatic assessment of which system offers better terms for specific transactions. And that pragmatism, more than any geopolitical strategy, is what reshapes the global financial architecture. Because once two systems exist and practitioners are comfortable with both, market forces take over. The system that offers superior service for a given transaction wins that transaction. Multiply that by millions of transactions annually, and you get structural change, not through design, through competition. Let's talk about what happens in a graduate seminar at the London School of Economics when students debate whether the BRICS Gold Corridor represents a genuine challenge to dollar dominance. The seminar is titled International Monetary Systems, Stability and Change. The professor, a veteran economist who worked at the IMF for 12 years before returning to academia, poses a question. Is the BRICS gold settlement infrastructure merely a niche alternative, or does it represent the early stages of a multipolar monetary system? The debate that follows lasts the entire 2-hour session. One student argues that gold settlement is fundamentally limited. Gold is physical. Physical assets can't scale to match the speed and volume of modern digital finance. The system might work for large commodity transactions, but it'll never handle the trillions in daily currency flows that the dollar system processes. Another student counters, but it doesn't need to handle trillions in daily flows. It just needs to handle enough volume that participants have credible alternatives. Once alternatives exist, the dominant system loses its monopoly pricing power. That's what matters strategically, not absolute volume. A third student brings up network effects. Dollar dominance is self-reinforcing. People use dollars because other people use dollars. Breaking that loop requires enormous coordination. Even if gold settlement works technically, getting critical mass adoption seems impossible. Unless, another student responds, the dominant system makes using it actively painful, which is what sanctions do. Every time the US weaponizes dollar access, they give participants a reason to bear the coordination costs of switching. The worse the pain of staying, the more attractive alternatives become, even with high switching costs. The professor listens, doesn't intervene, lets the students work through the logic themselves. Eventually, one student raises the key question. So the real issue isn't technical feasibility or even economic efficiency. It's whether the United States continues to use financial access as a geopolitical tool. If they do, alternatives scale. If they don't, alternatives remain niche. The professor nods. Correct, she says. Which means this isn't really a story about gold. It's a story about the discipline, or lack thereof, that hegemons impose on themselves when wielding structural power. The seminar ends, but the students keep discussing it after class. in the hallway, over coffee, in study groups. Because they're realizing something that feels important. The stability of the international monetary system depends less on the technical properties of reserve assets than on the restraint of those who control access to them. Gold doesn't become viable because it's superior to dollars. It becomes viable because dollars are sometimes withheld. And once withheld often enough, the search for alternatives becomes rational, even if those alternatives are costlier, slower, and less elegant. Because certainty of access matters more than efficiency of access when the alternative is no access at all. Let's talk about what happens when a journalist at the Financial Times decides to write a long-form feature on the BRICS gold settlement system. The article takes 3 months to research. The journalist travels to Moscow, Beijing, Brasilia, New Delhi, interviews central bankers, trade officials, corporate executives, academic economists. The piece runs 6,000 words. It's titled, "The Quiet Infrastructure: How BRICS Nations Are Building Financial Alternatives Without Challenging Dollar Dominance." The article is careful, balanced. It doesn't claim that gold settlement is replacing the dollar. It doesn't predict imminent collapse of dollar hegemony. It just documents what's being built and asks what it means. The key passages. What's striking about the BRICS gold corridor is not its current scale. Settlement volumes remain below 10% of intra-BRICS trade, but its trajectory and strategic significance. For the first time since the collapse of Bretton Woods, major trading economies have operational, standardized infrastructure for conducting international commerce without dollar intermediation. Central bankers interviewed for this article emphasized that they view gold settlement not as a replacement for dollar systems, but as insurance. As one senior official put it, "We're not trying to end dollar dominance. We're trying to ensure that dollar dominance doesn't become dollar monopoly. Monopolies abuse customers. Alternatives create discipline." The infrastructure exists on a spectrum between fully operational and theoretical. Some bilateral pairs, particularly China-Russia and India-UAE, report regular, routine gold settlements. Others are still in pilot phases. But the mere existence of the infrastructure changes diplomatic calculations, even when it's not heavily used. American officials declined on-the-record interviews, but privately expressed concerns that gold settlement infrastructure could reduce US leverage in future geopolitical disputes. However, they acknowledged that direct efforts to prevent or sanction such arrangements would likely backfire by validating the exact concerns, dollar weaponization, that motivate participation. The article gets significant attention. It's cited in congressional testimony, discussed in central bank research departments, assigned as reading in graduate seminars, not because it reveals shocking secrets, but because it makes the invisible visible. Before the article, gold settlement was technical trivia, boring infrastructure. After the article, it's recognized as strategically significant infrastructure. And recognition changes behavior. Investors start paying attention to companies with high BRICS trade exposure. Policy analysts start modeling scenarios where dollar demand declines gradually. Corporate treasury departments start exploring whether gold settlement could benefit their operations. The article doesn't create change, but it accelerates awareness of change already underway, which is sometimes just as important. Let's talk about what happens 10 years from now, when someone tries to pinpoint the moment the international monetary system became multipolar. They won't be able to, because there won't have been a moment. No dramatic conference, no treaty signing, no crisis that forced transformation. Just accumulation of bilateral settlements, of technical standards, of pilot programs that became permanent infrastructure, of businesses choosing lower-cost options, of central banks diversifying reserves, of students learning to view multiple settlement systems as normal. By 2035, historians will look back and note that dollar dominance declined from 88% of global reserve holdings in 2000 to 73% by 2015, to 58% by 2035. That gold-backed settlement handled roughly 22% of trade among participating nations by 2035, up from effectively zero in 2020. That the United States remained the world's largest economy and most powerful nation militarily, but no longer enjoyed the exorbitant privilege of borrowing at artificially suppressed rates due to captive demand for treasuries. That this transition happened without war, without financial crisis, without dramatic rupture, just steady adjustment. Some analysts will call it managed decline. Others will call it maturation, from hegemony to leadership within a multipolar order. Both will be partially right, because the United States will remain enormously influential. American financial institutions will still dominate global markets. The dollar will still be the single most important currency, but not the only important currency. Not the currency that all global commerce must route through. Just one option among several. And in that shift from necessity to optionality lies a transformation as significant as any war or revolution, but quieter, less visible, easier to miss while it's happening, which is precisely why it succeeds. The room in Moscow is empty now. The technical working group finished its session hours ago. The final standards document has been approved. The implementation roadmap is complete. A cleaning crew moves through, emptying trash bins, wiping down the conference table, adjusting chairs. They don't know what was discussed here. Don't know that the documents signed in this room will, over the next decade, quietly reshape how billions of dollars in trade get settled. Don't know that what seemed like technical trivia, custody protocols, purity standards, settlement timelines, will prove to be the infrastructure of geopolitical transformation. They're just doing their job, cleaning a conference room, preparing it for tomorrow's meetings, which is appropriate, because this is how the world actually changes, not through grand proclamations, through technical standards approved in unglamorous conference rooms, through pilot programs that prove concepts, through gradual adoption driven by cost savings rather than ideology, through accumulation of small decisions that collectively reshape the terrain. The Brazilian economist who drafted the original proposal is on a plane back to Sao Paulo. He's exhausted. 3 days of intense negotiation, but satisfied, because the infrastructure will be built. Not perfectly, not immediately, not without problems and adjustments, but built. And once built, it will exist. An option, a fallback, an alternative, which is all it needs to be. Because the existence of viable alternatives changes everything, even when the alternatives aren't preferred, even when they're less convenient, even when they're more expensive in absolute terms, because they're less expensive than having no options at all. And in a world of diminishing trust between great powers, options have value beyond efficiency metrics. They have strategic value, insurance value, sovereignty value, the kind of value that doesn't appear in ledgers but shapes decisions nonetheless. The plane reaches cruising altitude. The Brazilian economist pulls out his laptop. opens a document titled Phase 2 Expansion, Considerations for Systems Scaling. Because the work is never finished. Infrastructure isn't built once and forgotten. It's built, tested, refined, expanded, adjusted, continuously, over years, over decades, until what seemed radical becomes routine, until what seemed impossible becomes unremarkable, until the future becomes the present, quietly, steadily, inevitably.